economic advisors. So Sheila, please come on up.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Great. So thanks very much for that kind introduction and mostly for the invitation. I love coming to Energy Week. There's always such great questions and such a great eclectic mix of folks here doing many, many different things. Today, I promised to talk about policy approaches to decarbonization, and I subtitled it The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly for reasons that'll become clearer. I mean, I think the kind of highlight is that there are lots and lots of different approaches that governments can take, that governments are taking to achieve some of the goals that Brian just mentioned, right? Largely kind of mitigation of climate change impacts. And I'm an economist, so I tend to really, you'll see that, for theoretical and empirical reasons, I tend to prefer the market-based approaches, carbon pricing and so on. But really the truth is that all of these different approaches, this menu of approaches that governments choose from, have upsides and downsides. And so I'm going to try to be as neutral as possible today, although you'll see my inherent kind of economic bias as we move through. So why are we doing this? Again, I probably don't need to go into much detail here in this room about this, but as Brian just mentioned, we are experiencing a climate crisis. Science is telling us that greenhouse gas concentrations in the upper atmosphere are increasing dramatically, starting with industrialization relative to the historic and the prehistoric record. And so that is creating a situation, in which global mean surface temperature is changing. And that has lots and lots of different economic effects. So things that you'll hear me talk about today and refer to today include temperature-related premature mortality. So when economists calculate what's known as the social cost of carbon, or the kind of estimated damages from a ton of carbon dioxide emissions over time, that is, sort of the lion's share of those estimates. The largest portion of those estimates tend to be related to these temperature effects on premature adult mortality and infant mortality in particular. And that actually has two ends to it, right? So the climate change, right, if the global mean surface temperature is increasing, that's the mean, but there are places, right, where you're going to be experiencing less extreme cold deaths and places where you're going to be experiencing more extreme heat deaths. And so globally, those kind of heat damages tend to outweigh the impacts of less cold, but that's, again, the numbers are different depending on where you are in the world. In addition, these temperature increases, temperature changes cause, kind of sublethal effects as well. So morbidity, increase things like, cardiovascular events and so on that are not necessarily going to lead to death, but are still costly in their own way. And also increasingly lots and lots of research showing impacts on learning, things like student test scores and so on, as well as reduced labor productivity. And initially, those labor productivity studies were mostly, as you might imagine, for outdoor employment, things like agriculture and construction. But increasingly, we find impacts on labor productivity even for, kind of indoor and service sector jobs as well. So when we're thinking about quantifying economic damages, we're looking at temperature-related premature mortality, morbidity, but also there are lots of other impacts, kind of not related to human death and illness, things like agriculture, kind of crop productivity, livestock. Just like the temperature impacts on people, these are positive in some places and negative in others. And so you want your climate models and your economic models to include both sides of the effect, and we do. As a result of sea level rise, both from kind of thermal impacts, right, the expansion of seawater under warmer temperatures, as well as melting, right, of polar ice caps. That sea level rise inundates some areas. It creates coastal damages from storms if they become more intense or more frequent and so on. And so again, economic models would want to capture those types of damages as well. There are changes in energy consumption. So if we have more air conditioning and less heating, right, we'd want to capture that as well in terms of economic impacts. Changes in water availability, ecosystem impacts. There are economists and political scientists who study human conflict and migration and links with climate change, right? So to the extent possible, one would want to try and capture all of those economic impacts. So this is just showing, I can't, sort of speak to all of these different effects that we've talked about today. And for some reason, most of this slide is not showing up. All that you can see here is the heat map of those mortality effects. So right in the current federal estimates of the social cost of carbon, those are primarily drawing from mortality impacts, on work by Tama Carlton and her colleagues recently published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where they build up from really rigorous kind of micro foundations these temperature mortality connections on the global scale at a very fine sort of spatial resolution. And so naturally what you can see is that those are going to vary across the globe. And they also vary importantly with countries' capacity to adapt to those increases, right? So as I mentioned, right, some places get fewer deaths from cold, other places get more deaths from extreme heat. But you want to take into account, again, in economic modeling, our capacity to adapt. And so what Carlton and her colleagues do is they estimate those mortality effects. They account for what's going to happen with growth in income over time in different countries and places in the world, what's going to happen with capacity to adapt, or sort of temperature mortality connection. An important adaptation mechanism would be the adoption of air conditioning, which itself has feedback loops, right? If we're doing more air conditioning, it would create additional emissions and so on. But importantly, when they do that, what they find is you can really kind of push down, right, that relationship between temperature and mortality quite significantly over time. And so again, right, when we calculate those damages from carbon emissions and from climate change more broadly, we want to make sure we account for those types of adaptations. So again, it's way too little time, right, to kind of delve into the modeling efforts that go into something like that. But I'll just summarize at a very high level this idea that climate change generates significant economic damages. And when we convert that to kind of GDP, right, or gross domestic product, and look at that at the global scale, a super conservative estimate, I'm using this as sort of a nice visual for you, but not necessarily as current as we'd like it to be. This is based just on Bill Nordhaus's DICE model. Bill Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for his work integrating kind of global models of the macroeconomy with simple models of the global climate several years ago. And if we use that quite conservative model by today's standards, we would estimate that business as usual, right, kind of just movement along the kind of emissions trajectory that we would have had prior to the Paris Agreement, and I want to talk about the Paris Agreement in just a minute, would cost the global economy about 4% of GDP annually by 2100. This is a graph that I worked on when I was in the position Brian mentioned as a senior economist working in the White House. And it was issued as a kind of blog post by the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the time, Jason Furman, as well as Brian Deese, who was at the time President Obama's chief climate advisor. He is just stepping down now from a position in the Biden administration as head of the National Economic Council. And what we were showing was, hey, okay, if we, the blue bottom line is that, 4%, approximately 4% per year of GDP lost to these damages from climate change by 2100, if we're just all kind of rolling along, doing our own thing, not doing any significant emissions abatement. The purple line is showing, right, if all countries kind of met the commitments that they made in the December 2015 Paris Agreement, right, that we could avert some of those damages, right, go from about 4% of global GDP losses per year by the end of the century to about 3%. If you assumed countries were going to continue kind of reducing their emissions or making more stringent commitments along the lines of the kind of a trend that you could see developing within the Paris Agreement itself. That's the red line. Again, you could avoid some additional damages. And then if countries reached kind of global net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2080, that's the green line at the top. Can't avoid all damages. As we know, we're already experiencing economic damages from climate change, but you could get pretty close to zero. And so the bottom line here, right, is that business as usual is not free. There's a cost to just kind of experiencing climate damages. And then the question becomes, as countries work to characterize these damages and to try to address them through a set of cooperative global institutions, I put sometimes before cooperative, it's not always the most cooperative process. What we're trying to understand as economists is how to balance, right, the cost of taking these measures against the cost of doing nothing, right, against that, sort of loss of global GDP from climate damages. And so that Paris Agreement that was concluded in, as I mentioned, December of 2015, the pattern there was that countries agreed to what were called nationally determined contributions. And they, right, sort of had a set of, each country decided on their own, right, what they were going to commit to, whether that was targets and timetables, right, or something a little bit more general. And what you can see up there, this is a figure from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that just came out, synthesis report, summary for policymakers, that was in the news last week or a couple of weeks ago. And what you can see is a few things in this diagram. The first thing to notice is that little kind of gray line, that bar with the dotted line in the middle at the top, is showing you the kind of range of emissions reductions that would be possible if countries that have made these agreements in Paris achieved those goals, right, that they've sort of set out for themselves by 2030. That's the kind of range of emissions reductions that we might expect. That's the first thing to notice. And then the next thing to notice is that red line, the sort of solid red line, is a kind of middling, estimate of what we could achieve with policies that have already been implemented today. And what you see first is, wow, right, we're kind of at the top of that, what's potentially feasible, right, in the Paris agreements, which is telling us that the policies that countries have committed to and have kind of on the books are not like quite as ambitious as they would need to be in order to reach those Paris goals. The next thing to notice is that there's a ton of uncertainty, right? If you look at that implemented policies line, there's the solid line through the middle, but then there's a huge kind of uncertainty range around that in terms of what's actually possible with those policies. And that's just sort of think about how hard it is to, model what's happening with the climate system. And then you throw in the fact that in an economic model, right, and in a policy model, we've got a bunch of people and a bunch of firms that are making choices and a bunch of governments, right, that are doing things and then repealing them and then maybe trying again, right? And so that creates a ton of uncertainty about what's actually achievable, right, from what's on the books. The next thing to notice is that in the Paris Agreement, one of the big achievements, right, has been that countries agreed to try to limit warming, right, to engage in activities that would try to limit that warming trend to stay below 2 degrees Celsius in terms of the global average relative to pre-industrial global mean surface temperature. And then they had kind of an aspirational goal to see if they could go further and limit to 1.5 C. But right now we're between 1 and 1.5 degrees C of warming over pre-industrial measures. And so what you want to notice is both the implemented policies and that little gray range of the kind of nationally determined contributions that were agreed to in Paris are quite far above what would be necessary to actually achieve that goal, right? And sort of drive things down onto that green path or even close to that green path. That is, even if we were really optimistic about implemented policies and we were somewhere near the bottom of that uncertainty range of that red, right, that sort of red shadow, we're still not going to get right to that point where we're going to limit warming to 2 degrees C, which, right, the science is telling us could be sort of an important threshold to try and avoid. So that leaves us in a position where we say, okay, how are individual countries approaching this problem? How do we think about this from the position of a country like the United States, right? Balancing, right, this kind of cost of climate action against the costs of inaction. And so I'm going to talk very specifically about what's going on in US policy. This is a picture from the Biden administration's recent long-term strategy. So under the Paris framework, countries are kind of regularly reporting on their progress toward the goals that they set up. And so this is part of that kind of infrastructure. It's like a step, a kind of a just piece of information within that infrastructure. And what you can see is the actual path of, kind of historic emissions in black there at the top between 1990 and 2020. And then our kind of Paris goals left over from what was committed to during the Obama administration in 2015 was that kind of getting 26 to 28% below emissions where they were in 2005 by 2025. And then additionally 50 to 52% below 2005 emissions by 2030. And then the Biden administration has kind of layered on top of that some additional ambitious goals of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And so if we're to achieve those goals, then we need to be on the blue track and then the green track, right? And then the red track over time. An additional step would be to say, okay, where do we think those emissions reductions are going to come from? Okay, and so then for that, you would look at the Biden administration's current policy, you would look at a similar document, right? This long-term strategy document, where they identify these specific sectors and kind of types of approaches or groups of approaches that the administration thinks, right, is kind of where the meat of these reductions are going to take place. And you can see that biggest one there is labeled energy transitions. That's the kind of blue, the kind of blue vertical bar there. And that includes hydrogen, includes low carbon fuels, and includes electrification. So importantly, from the Biden administration's perspective, would be things like electrifying a lot of transportation so that we reduce those emissions, right? So that's the shift toward electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And then the other kind of second and third largest chunks, right, the dark green and the light green, right, there's fossil fuel with CCS or carbon capture and storage. There's zero carbon electricity generation that would include things like wind and solar. And then there's more specific transportation sector policies, things like, you know, corporate average fuel economy standards becoming more stringent and so on. And then also buildings and industry, right, reducing industrial emissions and then building energy efficiency, right? So that's that energy efficiency piece in the lighter green. Okay. So that's all well and good, right? Some of the thinking about where those emissions reductions are going to come from comes from thinking broadly about costs and where the kind of low-hanging fruit are, right? Not necessarily thinking about what's politically feasible when we're doing a chart like this, but thinking about, you know, where do we think those reductions are most likely to take place? But you still need to go a step further, right, and decide, right, how exactly, right, if that's the kind of general plan, how exactly is that going to be achievable? How is it that, right, a country like the United States can reach those mid and late century goals? Well, I'm an economist, so first I got to speak up for markets, right? So the private benefits of decarbonization in some cases exceed the private costs. And so in those cases, markets can move us toward these goals. So a great example of that would be the combination of electricity deregulation, that kind of electricity market deregulation in Texas, and dramatic reductions in the cost of renewable electricity production, right, have combined, right? There are other things that are happening as well. Yes, there are subsidies for wind and solar, and we'll be talking about those in just a few minutes. But those market forces have been very, very powerful and have contributed a lot to reductions in emissions from the electricity sector, not just here in Texas, but elsewhere in the country and in the world. And so that is a huge force, and it's very important not to be overlooked. But because most of the benefits of decarbonization are public benefits rather than private benefits, that is, if a firm invests heavily in decarbonization, it may have some financial incentive to do that in some contexts, but a lot of the benefits of that activity are going to spill over to not just kind of other firms, other, you know, households right outside of the firm, but also to other firms in other countries, its competitors, right, and so on and so forth. So even where firms are experiencing climate damages, right, so you might have a refinery affected by excessive rainfall and Hurricane Harvey that climate scientists, you know, tell us was much heavier than it would have been in the absence of anthropogenic warming. Yes, that firm has an incentive to invest in climate mitigation, but if it does so by doing things like reducing emissions, the benefits of that activity flow almost 100% to other firms, to households, right, and even outside of the borders of the United States. And so that makes this a very challenging problem, and it tees up a really critical role for policy. And that's why we see so much policy intervention in this space. Okay, so in terms of specific policies, where we are right now, right, the kind of Biden administration era main policies have taken place as major kind of legislative packages. And the two that we'll talk a bit about, or that I'm going to be characterizing a little bit here, are the Inflation Reduction Act, right, in 2022, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And what you can see here is this is from a Department of Energy fact sheet. So it's kind of the administration's own view and kind of estimates about what is achievable through these two major packages of legislation and which sectors are really going to kind of give us the emissions reductions that they're estimating are coming out of this approach. And what you can see is, right, they're saying, hey, here's emissions net economy-wide GHG emissions. This is in the graph over on the left, on your left, in 2005. And we think through these two major pieces of legislation and all of the parts therein, we're going to get down to about a 40% reduction by 2030. So one thing to notice about that is, first, it's quite ambitious. You'd say, well, that's the administration's own estimate. How realistic is that? My answer is it's hard to say. There is a good independent estimate by the Rhodium Group that puts it in the range of 32 to 42%. So I think it's nice to have that external validation. I would say the administration's estimates are, you know, a little on the high end of that range. So maybe, you know, that would be a signal that it's somewhat optimistic, but it's hard to say. It's really hard to say at this point. That's the best estimate I think we have is in that kind of 30 to 40% range. And then specifically, right, the idea is, you know, this kind of because of the approaches that are included in these two huge and complex packages of legislation, most of that emissions reduction will come from the power sector, some from industry, some from building, some from transportation, and then some in that kind of other category. And we can get even more granular, right, and say what specifically, you know, what specifically can we choose? What kinds of approaches could we choose to try and squeeze out, right, emissions from the power sector, from the industrial sector, from transportation, and so on? And economists often will make this big distinction between what are called prescriptive or command and control approaches, things like technology standards, right, requiring that firms all use a specific technology, or performance standards, slightly less restrictive, right, not requiring a specific approach, but requiring that everybody, right, kind of have the same ceiling on emissions or ceiling on their emissions rate. And we'll often make distinctions between those and the more kind of market-based approaches. So carbon pricing approaches like taxes and cap and trade, and then subsidies, which could include direct payments, tax credits, which seems to be the kind of preferred approach in the United States right now. And so I'm going to make some distinctions between these, talking about specific policies. Again, I can't touch on everything, but I would first just note that policymakers on the ground, right, once we decide these very kind of I've got this lofty goal, I'm going to get net zero by 2050, right? And on the way, I'm going to reduce emissions 50% by 2030 over 2005. And I think these sectors are the ones where the, reductions are probably most likely to take place. Now I have this very hard problem, right, of finding the policy instruments that are going to get me there. And again, I can't be as comprehensive as I would like in a fairly short amount of time. But policymakers have a really complex menu of things they're trying to satisfy, right? The sort of boxes that they want to check when they engage in that process. I'm highlighting just 5 things here that are super important, right? As they kind of come to the table and think about these things. The first, maybe the most obvious, is effectiveness. You'd like to know that the policy you choose might meet your emissions reduction goal, right? Or at least you have a decent chance of meeting your emissions reduction goal. If not, why would we do it, right? These policies can be very expensive, right? And so if we're not going to get the benefit, then that's not a great choice. A second, but very important component would be cost effectiveness. Now, economists are really crazy about this criterion. We really tend to hammer on it a lot, and I'll be talking about it a fair amount today. But the idea here is that, right, for an equally effective policy that is kind of holding all else equal, if I could get 20% reduction in emissions here from policy A, or a 20% reduction from policy B, and policy B is cheaper than policy A, then from an economic perspective, I'm going to tend to prefer B, right? It's the cost effectiveness criterion is simply the ability to meet an emissions reduction goal as cheaply as possible. Another important criterion is the capacity of the policy to induce innovation and technological change. For climate policies, that is absolutely critical. We're talking about goals that are set, decades out into the future, firms that are making investments today for infrastructure that's going to last many decades into the future. And so knowing that we have policies in place that will induce firms and households to adopt cheaper ways of reducing emissions is really, that sort of gives us a lot of confidence that we're going to be able to meet those goals, right? Rather than things getting more and more expensive, ideally, right, things will get cheaper over time, as they have in some sectors like the electricity sector, right? It's become cheaper to attain emissions reduction goals over time. And we want that trend to continue. That's a very positive trend from an economic perspective. Another thing policymakers are often very concerned about, very focused on, is an equitable distribution of costs and benefits. What one person means by equity is very different from what another person means by equity. So there are lots of debates over these things, but we see this playing a very large role in debates over climate policy within the Biden administration and within the Congress during the Biden administration. Very strong focus on energy justice, environmental justice, and so on. So that's critical as well sometimes. And then importantly, it doesn't work if it can't pass, right? So political feasibility is absolutely very, very important, right? I'm not a political scientist. I'm going to talk a little bit today about where politics has landed us, but I'm not going to be the best person to help us understand exactly why, right, that's been the case. But it's certainly, I can highlight it as a very important point that policymakers have in mind as they make these choices. Okay, so let's start with some of our kind of good news, bad news, ugly news. The good news is, right, from an overarching perspective, when you look at some of these climate goals that the United States has set, they do seem ambitious when you hear about them, right? Gosh, net zero by 2080, 50% reduction by 2050. These are big and lofty goals. The good news is, if you look at analysis by institutions like the International Monetary Fund, and you look at academic analyses of assuming the sort of cheapest possible approach, which are going to tend to be these market-based approaches like carbon taxes, cap and trade, the IMF suggests the US could reach its Paris mitigation goal, not necessarily, this is before President Biden's additionally ambitious goal of net zero by 2080. But if the IMF suggests the US could reach that Paris goal with an economy-wide carbon tax of about $35 per ton. Okay, that was just 3.5 years ago. The bad news, carbon pricing is a political non-starter in the United States. So as all of us know, right, that's not kind of where we've ended up. I've already mentioned the two big pieces of legislation, and neither of those, right, involved carbon pricing. But it's fascinating that that's the case. So what I've got up here on the left is a graph that's reproduced from a paper by Daniel Ramey and Jason Bordoff and some others. And most of the data that's in this graph is from a paper by Jim Stock and Ken Gillingham from a couple of years before that in 2018. And they engage in the very difficult process of trying to put a price tag, not on, sort of general sectoral emissions reductions for power sector and for industrial facilities or anything like that, but on actual policies, right? They try to estimate, and if you want you to think about the price tag here as kind of dollars per ton of CO2 emissions reduction. And that price tag varies dramatically across what is currently the US menu of these very granular, right, sort of sector specific decarbonization policies. So I want you to kind of have that, $35 per ton, kind of carbon tax in mind, and then look through this menu of policies. At the top, I know it's hard to read the tiny writing from the audience, and I do have my glasses. I can read it even better. That top row is a dedicated battery electric vehicle subsidy. Again, this was an estimate that was done in 2018. So not speaking directly to the subsidies that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act or any kind of current policies, but generally that's a pretty expensive approach, right? So subsidizing EV batteries, or electric vehicles is a pretty expensive approach to reducing CO2 emissions. That they put that, kind of central estimate around $640 per ton. Weatherization assistance, the Cash for Clunkers program, which was an Obama era stimulus, part of the sort of stimulus package back during the very start of the Great Recession, in which people could trade in, they had an incentive to trade in older, more polluting vehicles for newer, less polluting vehicles. Also quite an expensive approach. Solar PV subsidies you see up there at above $2,000 per ton, low carbon fuel standard around $3,000 per ton in terms of so these are very, very expensive approaches. And so I find it sometimes endlessly fascinating, right, that a carbon tax is out of reach politically, but would actually be a whole lot cheaper, right, from an economic perspective than would some of these granular and sort of very sector specific policies in comparison to the kind of technology neutral approach. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind. Again, the good news is that many decarbonization policies do have a relatively low per ton cost. So if we go back here, you can sort of see, the ones with the bars that are over closer to the zero mark there on the horizontal axis are the cheaper, tend to be the cheaper approaches. And then the width of the bar is the kind of uncertainty range, right, of the estimates that Jim and Ken were able to come up with when they did this interesting work. So many decarbonization policies have a relatively low per ton cost. The bad news, ironically, in the US, the least costly policies have had the lowest political feasibility, and we have been stuck there for decades, right? So it's hard to blame the Biden administration for this. It's just simply, has been a political fact in the United States for quite a long time. This is a graph from a paper that I worked on with Chan Riju, who was a student of Ben Leibowitz's and many other co-authors, including political scientists and lawyers, where we did kind of before the Inflation Reduction Act came down the pike, we were looking at different scenarios for trying to build some of these very sectoral specific granular policies into a broader energy modeling exercise and understand, sort of what would happen under different levels of political alignment over, right, kind of the stringency of climate policy. And so that kind of first set of bars is a low alignment scenario, which is not unlike, where we are today, which is actually, it's interesting, right, that the administration was able to kind of help push through those legislative packages in that low alignment scenario. And then kind of a medium alignment is like a little more kind of political, right? Sort of the parties are kind of closer in alignment over what they want to achieve. And then a high alignment scenario would be even more so. And my political science colleagues did a nice job of building that into the model. And then what you can see is that as we get, the orange bar is kind of what you would expect, right? The vertical axis here is measuring costs and sort of average abatement costs in dollars per ton. So similar to the measures that we were looking at, right, for the specific policies on the prior slide. And the orange bars are saying, hey, if we get a higher level of political alignment, we get more and more ambitious climate policy, then the cost per ton of those, right, with a kind of carbon cap of some kind in place, the cost per ton of those policies is going to go up, right? That makes sense. We're just going to maybe do, cheap stuff first, and then we're going to do more expensive stuff and more expensive stuff and so on. And then the green bar is showing that interesting contrast that it's actually in the low alignment scenario where what was achievable in the United States are fairly expensive approaches, right? That's why the bar is the highest in that green bar, right? And these are for these kind of packages of sectoral specific policies that we're able to include in our model. And then as you get, sort of closer and closer alignment between the parties, you actually get the cheaper policies, more like the carbon pricing and the cap and trade. And so the cost per ton ends up coming down, even though those sectoral approaches are still more expensive than the kind of economy-wide, sort of lowest cost approach. So we found that super, super interesting. Again, kind of good news and bad news, globally, carbon pricing is on the move. So in 2022, there were 68 such policies in place. Some of them are national, some of them are subnational, like California's cap and trade system, you can see highlighted up there in red. And then 3 additional policies and kind of programs on deck. They cover, it's now close to a quarter of global GHG emissions are priced. So from an economic perspective, it's an exciting time to be studying this stuff. The bad news is that prices on average are not high enough to avoid that 2 degrees C warming, right? So that goal that was set in Paris, there are some important exceptions to this. The biggest exception, and one that I'll mention briefly, is the European Union's emissions trading system, where prices have been over the past year or more approaching and sometimes exceeding 100 euros per ton. You'll notice on this map that some of our most important trading partners, including all of the European Union, Canada, China, right, all are taking as kind of a keystone toward their Paris commitments, carbon pricing, and we stand out in that regard. But again, I'll mention, so prices, so Europe is the positive story. Canada, things are changing rapidly as well. So the nationwide minimum carbon price went up to 65 Canadian, which is about 47 US per ton in January. It's on its way to 170 Canadian. Currently, that would be about $123 US per ton by 2030. So that's just 7 years down the road, taking a similar approach as they did in the EU, right, where we're sort of starting low and then moving higher over time. China's cap and trade system, the equilibrium price in late 2022, in contrast, was about $7.50 per ton. But again, if you were to go back and look at that graph from Ian Perry, those kind of estimates of what kind of a carbon price would be needed in each country to achieve, right, sort of significant emissions reductions, China's rate need was somewhat lower, quite a bit lower actually than the United States. So it's not, $7.50, right? It's be higher than that, but it's not $35 either, which is what was the estimate for the US. Okay, so in that EU system, you might ask questions, and again, thinking about our policy goals, we're interested in effectiveness. So the EU system is probably the most well-studied. It's been around for a long time now. The estimates of emissions impacts were fairly low early. Prices were quite low early. And then there was also the Great Recession, which complicated our ability to really understand what was happening in that system. But you can see these estimates here, kind of very early estimates. The system starts in 2005. So a study in 2010 shows 2 to 5% decrease in emissions with quite low prices that were present between 2005 and 2008. 8% is the estimate for phase 2. And then another estimate says about 4%, right, between 2008 and 2016. I think the most interesting recent work on this is by Jonathan Colmer at UVA and his colleagues. They are looking just at France, where they have really kind of good firm level data and a bunch of interesting things that they're able to look at. And they show that between 2005 and 2012, the EU ETS reduced CO2 emissions by between 14 and 16% in France. And interestingly, you can see there with the graphs on employment and value added, no statistically detectable effect on those outcomes for firms, which is obviously important and interesting to policymakers as well. Okay, in contrast, right, I gotta now stop singing the praises of carbon pricing, can't help it, sort of part in my genes, but I will talk about what the US is currently doing, relying primarily on subsidies, and we're gonna talk about some of the kind of good, the bad, and the ugly there as well. Since the United States had a sort of failure to achieve comprehensive carbon pricing in 2010, it's hard to imagine that we were actually there. There were some close moments, sort of comprehensive nationwide carbon pricing, a cap and trade passed out of the House in 2010, but had no traction in the Senate. There has been no real viable path to such a national carbon pricing system. And so here we are, we have these 2 major legislative packages, the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021, the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, as noted The administration is hoping that these will reduce CO2 emissions together by about 40% by 2030. And the two packages provide a mountain of new, kind of spending and tax breaks toward that goal. So what's the big deal? Why would this be, why do I want to make some contrast between carbon pricing and a decarbonization subsidy? So on the one hand, right, I mean, a carbon price charges firms and households for an economic bad, right, for creating emissions that are changing the global climate. And isn't that just the flip side of the subsidy coin, right? A decarbonization subsidy, in contrast, pays firms or households for an economic good, right? Reducing emissions that are changing the global climate. And in some important ways, they are somewhat equivalent, right? They're both economic instruments. They both can achieve, right? They can be effective in achieving the goal. But economists are usually going to draw quite a number of distinctions between these carrot and stick approaches that come not just out of theory, but out of empirical evidence with these kinds of approaches over time. Again, the good news is that some subsidies are efficient, and I'll talk about those in just a minute, whether carbon is priced or not. That is, even if we had comprehensive carbon pricing in the United States, things like R&D subsidies for carbon capture and so on would still be, from an economic perspective, justifiable on efficiency grounds. So that we'll talk about those conditions in just a minute. The bad news, sometimes the ugly news, right, is that subsidies can be costly and they can potentially be counterproductive. So we're going to talk about that as well. What I have here in the graph that's on your left is just, right, kind of a description of the full set of subsidies and the different activities and sectors to which they're directed. That's part of just the Inflation Reduction Act. But again, the bipartisan infrastructure law also had quite a few subsidies for things like EV charging station networks and many other things that are important to the energy transition. So when are subsidies a good economic idea? So this is first the good news, right? So first, I would say they're a good idea when you are addressing a positive externality, right? That the market is unlikely to capture on its own. So research and development is a classic case of this, right? Where the benefits of invention and innovation are going to spill over to other firms, right? And so trying to make it so that firms can capture a larger share, if not the full share of their investments in research and development for publicly important, socially important technologies like carbon capture or, right, kind of battery storage or something like that, is an important and economically often justifiable initiative. Another common case, right, in which economics would, suggest that subsidies are warranted is the case of learning by doing, right, where many firms can lower costs when one firm gains experience, right, and sort of left to their own devices, firms are not generally going to engage in that kind of information sharing, right? It's a competitive market out there. And so the extent to which the government and government policies can influence and incentivize learning by doing, that's generally a good idea as well, a nice use of subsidies from an economic perspective. Another often justifiable use of subsidies is to provide network externalities, right? So things like EV charging stations, right? Transmission for renewable electricity, CO2 collection infrastructure for carbon capture and storage systems. Why? Well, again, because the sort of benefit of investing in those kinds of technologies, right, in an electric vehicle or in renewable electricity generation depend really critically on, right, this kind of network infrastructure. Without the network infrastructure, these kinds of assets are not nearly as valuable, and in some cases have no value at all, right? And so, again, this is an important role for subsidies from an economic perspective, is in promoting, right, the provision of those kinds of infrastructure. There are also economic justifications sometimes if you're addressing information asymmetries in the market or behavioral issues. So a classic information asymmetry example would be principal agent problems. That is, if I'm a renter and, right, I live in a very energy inefficient home, right, but I'm paying the electricity bills and I'm paying the water bills and so on. Well, the landlord is the one, right, who would make the investment in a heat pump or, right, whatever the technology happens to be, and they're not paying the electricity bills, right? So that sort of separation between the agent, right, that is making the decision, right, about the technology to purchase and the one that is bearing the costs is a classic case for, kind of justification for intervention in the form of subsidies or some other approach. And then there's a somewhat controversial, sort of wading down now into kind of more controversy in terms of the field of economics, There's a sort of strain of literature and folks who would argue for things like corporate average fuel economy standards, stringent, kind of vehicle standards, or building of energy efficiency standards, on the basis that consumers tend to undervalue those types of investments. Maybe they make mistakes in sort of discounting and understanding the present value of the investment and the energy savings that they might experience over time. And you'll see that a lot in regulatory impact analyses for things like CAFE standards and other things in the federal government. If we look at the economics literature, I'd say the evidence for that is pretty mixed, right? So there's studies that would suggest that that's in fact the case, and other studies that would suggest that it's not. So it's an important question. It's a kind of hot area of research in economics. But again, certainly it's possible, right, to justify in some cases subsidies in those kinds of situations. Okay. Subsidies also have downsides, and I just want to flag those without being a, necessarily kind of a policy basher. But at least just make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what these things can achieve and what some of the potential red flags might be. So the first downside, and the reason that they're not treated, if you took my environmental economics course, right, or really any environmental economics course at the undergraduate level, at the master's level, at the doctoral level, when we teach this, we talk about these differences, important differences between subsidies and carbon pricing, right, or for any pollutant, doesn't have to be carbon. Subsidies for emissions reduction can be counterproductive, and they can even, in some cases, increase emissions. So let me just give you a couple examples of that. One is my colleagues Karen Palmer and Dallas Bertrand at Resources for the Future many years ago, back in 2005, showed in a modeling exercise that renewable electricity subsidies to generators of wind and solar electricity can increase the total electricity supply, which reduces power prices, which increases consumer demand. So that's an unintended side effect, right, of subsidizing the renewables, and it reduces those subsidies' capacity to drive down emissions. Now, it doesn't eliminate their capacity to drive down emissions, and the more and more sort of renewable electricity is on the grid, the less important this kind of unintended side effect would be. If it's all solar, right, then use as much as you want, right? But right, it's an important thing to keep in mind, and you want to sort of have that in your model as you think about deployment of subsidies like that. Another example would be subsidies for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. We have those, they're richer than ever, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act increased the per ton incentive for carbon capture for geologic storage from $50 per ton, which is where it was headed to in 2026, to $85 per ton. So it's a very significant increase. That's under Section 45Q of the Internal Revenue Code. So sometimes that policy is referred to simply as 45Q. Because it's paid in dollars per ton of emissions, right? I mean, dollars per ton of capture, but that's really also dollars per ton of emissions. You're giving the biggest payments to firms with the highest emissions, right? So that can prevent or delay the exit of the more polluting firms, right? The kind of higher carbon intensity firms from the market relative to what you would see under a carbon price, and that just creates an inefficiency. It's, again, an unintended effect, and it would tend to reduce CCUS subsidies' capacity to drive down emissions. So that's the first downside, right? We have these kind of unintended side effects that are potentially counterproductive. And that's quite different from a carbon pricing approach. Another thing that you'll notice is that subsidies are inefficiently costly relative to many other policies. That results partly from these unintended constant sort of side effects, right? But also from some of the other specific things that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But what you'll notice is you go back and you kind of look at that graph, right, of subsidy of policies that I showed you earlier and their relative costs per ton. If you kind of look at the stuff that's at the top, which is, tends to be the more expensive stuff, a lot of those programs are subsidy programs, right? The dedicated battery electric vehicle subsidy, weatherization assistance program, cash for clunkers, biodiesel, solar PV subsidies, and so on. So it's not terribly surprising, given what we know, again, from kind of theory and empirics and economics, that is the case. The third challenge with subsidies is that the government has to, and many people have heard this phrase before, has to, quote, pick winners, right? They have to subsidize specific technologies, and within those technologies, specific firms, specific households, right, that to receive those subsidies. And there's the risk that long-term government support for that select group, right, could lock out others. And so the government, in designing these subsidies, would want to try and avoid those kinds of effects. Just again, to kind of dig into this one a little bit, this is a standard critique of industrial policy of all kinds, right? It's not a critique of just, right, kind of government intervention with respect to the energy transition. But if CO2 is priced, right, it's the market that picks the winners, right? The government has to pay subsidies to specific entities. And so that's what puts it in the position of having to do this in that, when we choose that policy instrument. And then the question is, right, do governments know enough about where markets are going to invest and kind of where the sort of low hanging fruit is to invest in the quote, right technologies and firms, right? The ones that are likely to be most successful and generate the greatest economic returns over time. And that's just a huge challenge, right, that they don't have if they take the carbon pricing approach instead. Finally, I'll note that some subsidies go to recipients who would have deployed technology even without the help from the government. Okay, so this is the kind of money for nothing argument. And I'll just give you an example of that. This is an Obama administration era example, is the Cash for Clunkers program. Again, this is a very popular program. And it's not super fair to pick on it for this reason, because really it was a stimulus policy, right? So again, take us back to the very start of the Great Recession, the financial crisis, and the goal was to get as much cash flowing in the economy as possible. They made some of that cash flow in the direction of climate policy, right, with the sort of additional goal of climate. So you can't really judge it, right, on the basis of emissions reductions. But if one were to judge such an approach on the basis of emissions reductions, right, its popularity, about $2.8 billion went out the door in less than a month for almost 700,000 transactions. They thought the funds would last for 3 months, and it went much, much quicker than that. So consumers love this program. But what my colleagues, Shan Lee, Josh Lin, and Bea Spiller show is that about 45% of the funds went to consumers who would have replaced a vehicle even without that subsidy, right? That consumers, in large part, basically just changed the timing of their purchase rather than the incidence of purchase, right? They just sort of traded in a vehicle at a different time than they might otherwise have done in order to benefit from the subsidy. And the diagram there is just showing, right, that you could sort of be moving, right, either from the future, right? You could either buy a vehicle earlier than you had planned to because the subsidy is available, or you could, move it up from right, wait, anticipate that it's coming, right, and then you could trade in your vehicle, a few months later. Okay, so where does that leave us? So I've just highlighted some of these important differences between the road not taken and the road taken, right? But what we have is a set of policies for the politics that we've got. And what I want you to just sort of take home is that it's a little unfair, right? Business as usual, no policy is not free, right? No policy, climate change itself is very costly, and it will continue to be so out into the future. This is just kind of repeating that graph that we talked about a little bit earlier. Remember, we don't want to be on the blue line, right? We'd like to try and get, right, sort of spend reasonable social costs to push up, kind of closer toward that green line. So we've got a set of policies for the politics that we've got. Markets alone can't meet the challenge. Many of our major trading partners, that includes all of Europe, Canada, and China, are deploying carbon pricing as their kind of keystone approach. We're experimenting in a very different direction, doubling down on subsidies. And the good is, hey, comprehensive climate legislation, some of it bipartisan, not all of it, is targeted to reduce US CO2 emissions about 40% by 2030. Might be slightly optimistic, but it might, again, sort of independent estimates suggest it's not out of the range. The bad is that this is going to be more expensive than it needs to be, right? From an economic perspective, that's a bummer. The ugly, and I think this is a challenge, right? So for students, especially in the room, is that when we think about the menu of policies that we've chosen, it's very granular, it's very sector specific. These are really tough to model. So, right, just coming up with that estimate of trying to get, how much is this actually going to save us in terms of emissions? That is an extraordinarily difficult exercise, even for people who are really, really good modelers. Even for the federal government, right, which has lots of resources, to throw at modeling and so on. And they don't have a lot of precedence on such a large scale. So I think it's very difficult to say, right, how well placed we are to meet some of these goals, right? We want to know that they're going to be effective in reducing emissions. We want to know that some of these unintended consequences can be avoided, at least to the extent possible, right? Or won't eat up too much of what's achievable on the good side. And that depends critically on robust evaluation, prospective modeling, which is already happening, as well as retrospective empirical evaluation, right? If we had known about cash for clunkers, right, before it's tough. Again, they were under the gun, right? The financial crisis was an emergency, right? Money had to go out the door. But if we'd known, right, that it was going to work that way, we might have designed it differently, right, to avoid some of those downsides. And I think that's an important point to leave us with. Okay. I think that's it. Yeah.
For that. Oh, powerful. You mentioned China and its carbon pricing, but it's really not an effective number. And worse yet, China last year approved over 100 new coal plants to be built. That represents 50% of the installed coal capacity in the world.
Yeah.
Unless China addresses this, are we just doomed anyway?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. You know, we teach, you know, climate policy in economics. Often we use game theory, right? And we think about, okay, where, you know, what are other countries doing? We have to think strategically with respect to other countries. And when I was in the Council of Economic Advisors, I was there, started under the Obama administration, and then I was there. These are one-year positions, and the design is such that senior economists stay through presidential transitions. And I stayed, and I was there for the first 5 months of the Trump administration. And I had a lot of conversations, right, about that very topic. Like, what, you know, should we withdraw from the Paris Agreement? You know, other countries are doing nothing. And the argument was, and those of you who had a game theory course will recognize this phrase, we are in the Nash equilibrium. And this is from the president's economic and climate advisors. And the Nash equilibrium, what I would say is, that's a bad outcome. I mean, that is sort of as a very basic principle, that's not where you want to be, right? What it means is everyone is just, right, every country is just kind of polluting as much as they want. And right, the sort of net social outcome is bad, right, relative to what's achievable if we cooperate. And then the challenge becomes, you know, do we believe that cooperation is possible? That's essentially what you're asking, right? Can we move forward in either, you know, kind of bilateral country to country negotiations or through the UN process, right? That's much, much broader. And can we get countries to follow along, right? And try to achieve what we're trying to achieve. I tend to be optimistic about that. I'm sort of an eternal optimist. And I think that we can, and I think avoiding the bad outcome, the bad equilibrium, is important enough that we ought to be trying as hard as we can. And part of that trying is leadership, right? Is kind of global leadership and showing the way. And I like the US having that mantle and trying to keep that mantle. I think that puts us in a really good position economically over time. Do I think that there are huge challenges, right, in dealing with an economic competitor, right, where the carbon price is $750 a ton? Yeah, I think that's huge. But I think it's worth trying to avoid the bad equilibrium.
Thanks, Sheila. Well, it was a weird echo over here. So let's